Endeavor, Horizons of the Infinite, Episode 24. Endeavor to Change Everything, Part 2. By Elton Garr. The plan was insane, and Tabitha was stuck being the pilot, which meant that they'd blame her for the fraction of a second before they all died. Not that any human could do what they wanted. Her piloting would all be programming the system before they started, and then pushing a button.
Last chance to get off the ship before you're killed,
Tabitha said, as she began to flip the switches on the expanded control panel. Patch had been upgrading the ship for months, and they had tested it a few times, but the results hadn't been promising.
It's not that bad. The first time I did this, we didn't have time to test anything,
Adrian said. This insane plan was a reenactment of the one he would use 15 years from now to save almost 100,000 soldiers.
which only means you didn't know how stupid it was. Everyone strap in. Best case scenario, we're crashing into the ocean at 350 miles an hour.
As soon as everyone had their crash suits and seatbelts on, Tabitha flipped the last switch. That turned off almost everything. Using the engine, or almost anything on the ship once they reached the planet, would guarantee they were spotted. With the lights out, it gave her time to wish Regan were here. There were very few humans who could surpass an enhanced Helix agent. That was the point of the augmentations, but Regan was a better pilot than her. They only entered FTL for about 30 seconds before they dropped out in the upper atmosphere of a planet. There was a blinding light. It didn't last long, but using the dampeners like that was why they hadn't died immediately. It would still set off alarms in the Asteron security grid. But the hope was that they would mistake it for a meteor hitting the atmosphere. Since the ship was in freefall, Tabitha just focused on the G-forces trying to crush her. The crash suit helped, but she was still barely able to breathe for the first seconds. And without engines, the drag of the atmosphere had barely slowed them to below the instant death threshold that she and Patch had worked out. The first shot from the guard ships just missed them and hit the water. Tabitha wondered if Patch's calculations on the ship's ability to survive the pressure took into account any damage from Asteron Dynamics weapons. Luckily, their best weapons were the most affected by the water. Plasma didn't survive long in water, and the refraction made lasers almost entirely useless. That left their missiles. And while a single hit from one of them would do enough damage to the hull that the ship would be crushed, they weren't designed for hydrodynamics. Then there was another, less intense flash of white as they smashed into the ocean floor. But even with the quarter second of dampeners she had programmed, she was convinced they'd all be dead without the crash suits and seatbelts spreading out the force. The metal plates slammed shut over the glass windows, and the ship creaked under the pressure, but they hadn't been crushed, and the crash had thrown enough dirt and silt that they would be effectively invisible for hours. With that done, everyone seemed to relax, and a few seconds later a single small red light came on. It was barely enough to allow them to see the shadowed edges of things in the room, but it was still probably more light than they should have. Any stray energy could help the Asteron Dynamics ships locate them. As they waited, dirt and sand began to settle on the ship. That was the core of the plan. There didn't seem to be an exact amount of time before people forgot any changes that they made, but it was never more than a couple of days. That meant that if they stayed here for 3 or 4 days, everyone would forget about the ship that had crashed into the water. And no one would be looking for them when they started the next part of the mission. About 2 minutes later, she heard a crunching sound. For a moment she was sure something was breaking under the pressure, then she realized it was Adrian eating potato chips. She didn't feel the same hunger as she would once she had several genetic alterations, but that made it easy to forget to eat for hours or days. She dug out the plastic bag next to her and took out a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Focusing on the food helped her relax. She felt better for 20 seconds, then there was a deep rumbling boom. Asteron didn't know where they were, so they were simply dropping charges and hoping to hit something.
Can the ship survive one of those?
Adrian asked, followed by the sharp crack of a chip as he tried to keep things calm.
I suggest we don't find out.
We can't move without being seen, and then we're guaranteed to get hit.
Edric said. There was another deep echoing boom, this one closer. After a few seconds of silence, the captain said,
Anyone willing to trade? I have a brownie, but I'm more in the mood for meat.
They sat in the dark eating for an intolerable amount of time. Then the explosion stopped. They had no way of knowing what that meant. Maybe they went to get more explosives, or they were changing tactics. Or maybe time had reverted, and no one knew they were there. Whatever it was, Adrian hit something, and the light in the room came up to about twice what it had been. Still dim, but far more comfortable. That seemed to be all Patch needed, and he stood and said,
I should get to work. I'm sure plenty of things broke on the trip down.
It was a waste of time. The original plan had them using this ship to get off the planet, but they had given up on that. Either this would work or they'd be captured, or possibly both. But if spending the next day or two fixing the ship made Patch feel better, then he should do it. Changing the plan also meant Tabitha wouldn't be asked to stay on the ship. Not that she had ever planned to be left out. She was more qualified for this than any of them, even in the body of a 13-year-old. Edric was a better spy, but his combat training was limited. 2 days later, they climbed into the small pressure chambers Patch had created. They would float to the surface while keeping them from dying from the pressure changes. Then once safe, they would open and could be used as a boat to get them to shore. The strangest part was the depressurization. Tabitha bobbed on the surface for hours as the pressure slowly adjusted, unable to do anything but watch the strange stars. Then, as soon as it was safe, the door popped open, and she was in control of her own destiny again. None of the other depressurization pods were visible, but they had planned for that. They had a rendezvous spot and should find each other before they got there. Using its tiny engine, the pressurization pod began to move, and she had to trust she was going in the right direction. It was dark when she reached land, and as she fought to pull the capsule onto the beach, she was reminded once again of how weak the body of an entirely normal 13-year-old girl was. Once it was safely on dry land, she gathered the supplies. If they were caught, their best chance was to look like they were just kids on a trip, too stupid to know that this place was restricted. Then delay until they forgot they were there. It was unlikely to work since they'd still be in a holding cell, but it was a chance. So she had a water filter, energy bars, a hatchet, a first aid kit, and a single tarp. And since it was dark, she got back into the box, pulled the top tight so animals couldn't get to her, and slept. She expected that someone would find her before she woke. She hoped it would be her team. But they couldn't afford to use transmitters or communicators, so they needed to get to the rendezvous spot. But getting there wouldn't be easy. Part of the reason that Asteron had picked this world was that it was dangerous. There were an abnormally high number of predatory omnivores on this world. So she wrapped up her supplies in the tarp, hung the hatchet on her belt, and followed the beach. Even moving along the shore was slow, as there were jagged rocks that went deep into the water and a thick tree line. As she grew tired, she found and cut a 4-foot-long branch from one of the trees. As the sap ran out, hundreds of small animals appeared from the sand. They were about an inch long and came out from the sand she had been walking on. They covered the cut and much of the tree below it. She was just beginning to think that she'd have no trouble getting enough food when other creatures began to appear. They were almost a foot long and were gray like the stone that was everywhere. They were feeding on the smaller animals, though one of the bigger ones bit at her leg. That drove her away. Her thick clothes would protect her, but she also didn't know what would happen if something slipped under them. She was about 20 feet away when she saw a creature about the size of a rabbit appear from the woods. It began to attack the others, grabbing them and shaking them like a dog might shake a toy. Almost without thinking, she took the hatchet out of the belt loop. She didn't know how much good it would do against the things here, but if she was going to be eaten alive, she would die fighting. Soon it became clear the beach wouldn't lead her to the rendezvous point. And the beach appeared no less dangerous than the woods, so she picked the faster option. She picked a trail at random. The path didn't really go anywhere, but there were other paths, and some moved in the right direction. More importantly, she began to convince herself everything here was too small to be a threat so long as she remained vigilant. Then something crashed through branches the size of Tabitha's neck onto the trail. Its hair was long and brown and green in patterns that hid it in the woods. Its body was lean and muscular, with pointed teeth meant for tearing flesh and 2-inch-long claws that would be more effective than Tabitha's hatchet. Uncertain what else to do, she grabbed the nearest branch and pulled herself up. Seeing its prey escape, the creature rushed forward and grabbed at her leg. The long claws ran across her protective clothing. But while that kept her leg from being turned into ribbons, it was still painful. Once she reached the next branch, the creature gave up trying to reach her, but it must have believed it injured her because it just curled up on the ground. It wasn't entirely wrong. She carefully pulled up her pants leg to see not only a growing bruise, but a few scratches. Nothing dangerous on its own, but while she was cleaning it and applying a bandage from the first aid kit, she had an idea. So after looking through the kit carefully, she took a large pill, stuffed it into one of her energy bars, then tossed it down so that it bounced off the creature's body and landed next to it. It jumped to its feet, perhaps not as secure as laying down had implied, and she wondered if there was something that hunted it. But after the surprise, it began to sniff the bar. As it did, small creatures began to appear out of the grass and woods, drawn by the smell of food. And the larger creature began to lick up hundreds of the creatures barely bigger than ants. That wasn't what she wanted, but perhaps if it was satiated, it would leave her alone. But it didn't take long for the animal to become bored with the bugs, and it simply ate the bar. This time it didn't lay down calmly like it had before. Instead, after a few minutes, it staggered and then tipped over on its side. It would be fine in a few hours, assuming there wasn't something odd about its biology. Still, it was just an animal trying to survive, and she had some fear it might be killed, so she took a few seconds to lay out the tarp. She then rolled the creature, which weighed as much as she did, onto it, then loosely rolled the tarp around it. It wouldn't have a hard time getting loose, but it would be much harder for anything to hurt it while it was asleep. As she stuffed everything else she had into pockets, she cursed Adrian for turning her into the type of person who wasted resources. That tarp might save its life, but it might have saved hers too. Still, she was only a day out from the rendezvous point, so she was unlikely to need it. But as she began to walk, she heard a deep howling that reminded her of something she should have considered. The animals on this world weren't just predators. They were almost all pack animals. And there was no reason to believe that wouldn't be true of the larger predators. So she began to walk faster, careful not to run, as in most ecosystems that triggered the predator's chase instinct. Half an hour later, she reached a large clearing around a pool of water. She knew the danger, but she couldn't turn down the chance for water. So she ignored the howling and walked into the clearing. She wasn't surprised to see something follow her out of the jungle. So she took the hatchet out as she pretended to bend down to fill her water. As soon as there was any movement, she spun, using the hatchet for leverage and range. The creature that was rushing her was twice as big as the one she had drugged. It slowed, surprised by her attack. But its instincts meant she didn't hit it with her hatchet. That was it. She might injure the creature, but she'd never win a fight with it. Except before it could move again, something else followed it out of the woods. something half its size with sharp teeth and 2-inch-long claws. The slash with its claws was quick, and it was rushing out of its range before the creature had turned far enough to swipe at it. The claws didn't cut deep into the larger creature's thick hide, but as it turned, another similar animal attacked from the other side, also doing just enough damage that it couldn't be ignored. She understood. This was the tactic of a pack of wolves attacking a bear. The larger animal might get lucky and hurt a wolf, but it was unlikely, and the wolves would wear it down. As she watched, she saw an attacker had her tarp in its mouth. That suggested an intelligence she hadn't suspected. And she was annoyed. There were agreements between corporations. Helix Dynamics should have been given access to tissue samples of anything with potentially interesting DNA, and that included high-level intelligence. The fight lasted longer than Tabitha wanted to watch. She had grown up in an environment almost as ruthless as this jungle, but she didn't want to see it. Once the fight was over, the one with the tarp still in its mouth walked over to Tabitha. She wanted to run, but that likely would get her killed. So she stood her ground, and it dropped the tarp at her feet. It then turned and returned to the others, who were beginning to eat the kill they had just taken down. Had it understood why she put the tarp over it? Was this gratitude? She wasn't sure, but she decided to test it, so she waited until they were done eating, instead of slipping away while they were distracted. She then continued towards the rendezvous. There were a few yips and a howl behind her, then the rest of the pack disappeared into the woods, but the creature that had returned her tarp followed her. She stopped just long enough to let it catch up. It moved next to her, and then waited until she started again and walked with her. With a personal bodyguard, the rest of the trip went fairly quickly, and she found the large outcropping of rocks where she would meet the others. She sat in the deep shadows, and the animal laid down not far away. Not sure what else to do, she took out one of her food bars. As she did, the creature lifted its head. She considered it, then broke it in half and tossed half of it to the animal. Though she wasn't sure it was an animal. It sniffed carefully at the food as she ate hers. Then it ate its half. A few hours later, it left and returned with 2 animals bigger than a rabbit. It ate one, throwing the other in front of Tabitha. It felt rude to ignore it, so she cut off strips of the meat and chewed it slowly, which seemed enough to placate the other until 3 days later when the rest of the team arrived. The creature arched its back, ready to guard her, but it didn't attack as she walked past it and introduced it to the 3 men who had traveled together. Seeing them made her feel better about the difficulties she had faced getting here. All 3 of the other humans were larger than her, stronger than her. They had traveled together and still looked as if they had barely survived the trip. Author's note:
I expected this part of the story to go faster. But as it's the end of the season, I don't want to rush things. So if it takes an extra episode or 2 to get through this, then I'm happy to take the time. That said, we're nearer the end than it might seem, and things are more connected than it might appear. Anyway, I hope everyone is enjoying my story. Thank you. Elton Gar.